So with that, I'll introduce our first speaker. His name is David Hedberg. David is an environmental historian and the owner of Outdoor History Consulting. He's a fifth-generation Oregonian, and he specializes in the craft of historical research and connects his findings to general audiences through project design and creative storytelling. He serves as the historian for the Portland Heritage Tree Committee, the Oregon State Heritage Tree Program, and he is the historian in residence at Northwest Documentary. And, most importantly, during his graduate studies, Gresham was lucky enough to have him come here and update our historic resources inventory. So, without further ado, let me introduce you, David, and please give him a warm welcome.
Great, thank you. Thanks for that introduction. And thank you all for being here today. A little bit about myself. It's really great to be here in Gresham because I was born here. So I was a wee little baby. Only lived here for a year, and my parents got a job down at Oregon State University. So I grew up in Corvallis, but I was born in Gresham. So what I'd like to do today is talk about some of the work I did updating the historic resource inventory for the city. And what we're going to do is we're going to talk kind of about these buildings, these structures, and you'll see them around town, and I've given the addresses. But really what we're going to be doing is talking a lot more about the people that are associated with these buildings.
Can we turn off the front light?
Sure, yeah, the lights here.
Clear? Oh, that turns out the whole thing. Never mind.
There may be a way to do it.
No.
I hope that's volume.
That's volume.
Okay.
Well, we can make it dark if everyone's okay with that. This is easier.
Yeah.
That won't do much for your recording, though.
Oh.
No.
And I think this is the screen.
There you go. It's okay. I just thought it's
Well, I'll try and point everything out. At least it's a black background with white text, so that should help somewhat. Out of curiosity, does anyone recognize this building here?
Yeah.
Most of you, yeah. So this is the John Roberts Elkhorn Ranch, arguably one of the oldest structures in the city. One of the issues when you're doing history on buildings like this is that you find that the record tells us, when the building was first constructed. When the building was first constructed does not reflect what we see today, though. So it's gone through numerous renovations over the years. And so it dates back to the 1860s, but the structure we see today isn't quite the same.
When was it built?
Well, first built in 1868, but that was more like a single bedroom cabin as far as I understand. Yeah, so this is an image, I believe, from about the 1890s. So again, you can see the front porch, some of the detail has been lost, although some of it's still there. But in a lot of ways, it has pretty striking resemblance to that structure in the past. So in talking about historic resources, we typically, this is typically a field that's dominated by architectural historians that like to describe buildings and the architectural features and their design elements. As an environmental historian, I'm less interested in that. I'm more interested in the broader context. We think about this building, where it's situated in its whole environment. So the building, the people that built it, the materials that went into building it, the roads that connected those materials out into the forest. That's kind of the way I approach historic resources. And in doing that, I see this great opportunity for preservation today being the business of saving communities and the values that they imply. So these just aren't historic structures. These are elements of Gresham and Gresham's history. One of my favorite resources that I helped update was the Percy Geesey hazelnut orchard and his farmhouse. So this is a 1880s historic farmhouse, and it had this massive hazelnut orchard right off present-day Pleasant View Drive. If you go there today, the farmhouse is still there. It's back in the corner. You probably most likely will just see the hazelnut grove there. What Percy Giese did back in the 1880s, 1890s, and turn of the century was create an industry where he grew hazelnuts, not for the nuts, but for the nursery stock. So he supplied the majority of the early Willamette Valley hazelnut growers. If you go down into the southern Willamette Valley near Eugene, there's a great heritage grove of hazelnuts, and that's the oldest hazelnut orchard that was producing nuts for consumption. But this grove actually predates that, and probably the nuts from the Doris Ranch came from Percy Giese's fields. So in a way, he kind of supplied the whole valley. Really cool industry.
And that would be why my neighborhood is called Filbert Hill.
That's exactly why your neighborhood is called Filbert Hill.
It's Filbert Hill.
Yeah, and so it's right there near Pleasant View Drive. And that was kind of what I did for the city when I updated these historic landmarks. So really quickly, I'll go over kind of how we evaluate a historic resource. We have three categories, roughly A, B, C. Category A, kind of my short term for that is the all people category. So these are the big patterns of history. A structure is significant under category A if it has an association with the lives of persons holding a significant place in the history of the community, in this case Gresham, or association with past significant events, trends, or values. Those could be cultural, economic, social, or political. The second category, category B, the resource possesses architectural significance. And that's kind of the dominant category we often see preservationists classifying these buildings under. It's a distinctive type, period, or method of construction. It's a structure that's early in the sequence of the local history, like the oldest building in Gresham. The rarity of the resource, this is a very unique type in this area perhaps. Or this is just the retention of integrity. That means like it's an exceptional example of that particular style. And the third category is that the resource represents the work of a particular designer. Maybe it's an architect, an engineer, or a master builder who influenced the development and appearance of Gresham, the state of Oregon, or the nation. So those are our kind of three categories that we lump everything under. Yeah?
Would it still fall into the range of trend and value in the area?
Would it still? Well, it needs to demonstrate that in the past, not necessarily today.
No, but I mean in the 30s.
Oh, like in the 1930s?
Yeah.
Absolutely. So something in the 1930s, a building in the 1930s that was emblematic of that time period. Yeah, you're evaluating in that particular period of time.
I mean, it was an active still.
Yeah. So what I started this project on with was this 1987 inventory. That was the first inventory of historic resources in the city. These are the original forms. We had, beginning in 1987, just a few properties. Today it's grown to 36 landmarks. Many of them are listed on the National Register of Historic Places, but the majority, 27 out of 36, are not. And so what I was tasked with doing is taking these old forms and updating them. If you remember those three categories, when I looked at these, what I noticed was they're not really addressing the categories at all. What they're saying is, for this particular property, the Heine house, the house was associated with the Heine family in Gresham. House faces site of Heine logging mill along Butler Creek. Old logging railroad grade runs up East Butler Canyon, north of house. And I was left thinking, well, who was the Heine family?
Yeah.
What was their logging mill? What did it do? What was the story behind it? This was the extent of that history. So as a historian trained in analyzing primary documents, I dug into local archives and kind of pulled out the human side of the story. And then went back to the properties and rephotographed them. Many of the owners gave me some really nice access. So what we ended up doing because of that was really having a lot more background information on who these people are, what are the elements and stories we can tell about, you know, the early influential people of Gresham. We have bibliographic sketches. You can actually download this whole report online. And so there's lots of attachments, photographs, newspaper articles, and a full bibliographic set of sources that I used as well. Yeah, did you have a quick question?
What does the city of Gresham offer as incentives for people to try and register their home as historic?
That's a great question, and I'm going to hold on it, and then we'll just remind me, we'll bring that up at the break. Yeah. So what I was able to come up with were these short statements of significance, and that's really what I'm going to share a lot with you today. So this particular house, digging through the records, going back to the deed, turns out that Hannah Heine, the daughter of Joseph and Rachel, was actually the one listed on the deed, which surprised me. For 1900, that was very uncommon. And in looking into the family's history, I learned that, in fact, they owned a sawmill. They were a very successful milling family, but they were also a very controversial family. Their family was always in the newspapers, surrounded in drama. They were lighting other people's houses on fire, burning fields down. There was murder. There was infidelity. There was all kinds of things. And so Hannah and Franklin, I think, really wanted to be on their own. And so Franklin made sure that his wife was on the deed, so that she would have that house and be able to have that security, and kind of keep it away from the rest of the family that way. So that's just an example of what happens when you actually start digging into the historical records and looking. So let's begin. I'll give kind of a more detailed explanation of a couple properties, and then I'll kind of speed it along and give you some shorter snapshots. We'll cover just about every property in some form in this presentation.
Of the 36?
Of the 36, yeah. So you'll get to at least hear about or see all 36. So one, it's a new addition. This is actually a property that was listed on the National Register just a few years ago. It's the David and Marianne Ott House. One of the significant pieces of this property is that it was designed by a renowned architect. So John Storrs, the famous architect who kind of coined the Northwest regional style, designed this home for the Otts. It was one of his earlier designs, so it really shows an early home in the Northwest regional style. They had all the documentation, and it kind of made for a fairly easy listing onto the National Register that way. And it's also a great local historic landmark. Gresham has a John Storrs. And there's people that do John Storrs tours all across the Northwest. They're just really into his designs. There's books written all about him. So that's an example of a famous architect. Another one that I'd like to talk about is the Louise home. This is out on 162nd, kind of on the edge, the border between Gresham and Portland. This was a home, it was a big institutional home, and it really came about at a time in U.S. society where the government did not offer social services. And so it was kind of benevolent Christian organizations that created these social welfare programs. And so this was an extensive 17-acre farm and wooded campus, specifically for unwed mothers. And like some of the other institutional homes in East Multnomah County, like the Multnomah County Core Farm. They were self-sustaining units, so they had to grow their own food, cut their own wood for heat. They hired a famous architect, Carl Wohlberg, to design the building. And so you can still go there today. It's got the groves of trees, very reminiscent of, this is a photograph from, I think, 1927 or something like that. So when I talked about those three categories, you don't have to have just one category. Sometimes you'll have a property that fits all three categories. And that's certainly the case for this one. So it's a 1912 Georgian Revival design, very unique to our area. So that just really pegs it as that criteria B, unique design. It also fits this criteria C because Carl Wohlberg, a famous architect, was really in the center of Portland and Northwest architecture in the 19-teens, 20s, and 30s. He was collaborating with some of the most famous architects out of his Portland studio. So it's another famous architect design. But it also is significant under this criteria A, where we have that broad pattern of history, in that it's one of many self-sustaining port farms located outside of the city. And this one being specifically for women. So that really fits into this bigger pattern of the community's history. So here's a shot before the building was even built, when it was just the early port farm, 1917. The women are milking a cow. Here's a shot of the woodlot that had been cut over and was becoming the pasture. So it was a very evolving landscape, kind of fitting all three of our criteria. Today, it's still a National Register landmark and a local landmark. It's undergoing a redevelopment project by Scott Edwards Architects, and they're designing this kind of addition to the building that looks very modern and differentiates from the original design. And that's a big thing we see in historic preservation. If you're going to revamp a structure, you need to make sure that we can tell the difference between the original historic building and the new renovation. So this is actually a celebrated design that's already won some awards.
Because it does both of those?
Because it does both of those. And if we think about it this way, a historic building needs to be used. Historic buildings that are derelict and abandoned are next to be bulldozed. So if we can keep historic buildings occupied and relevant and usable, if we have to make some modern additions to them, as long as they differentiate themselves, I think it's great. And that's probably how we're going to have to address a lot more buildings like this, especially unreinforced masonry buildings that would need expensive retrofits. We're going to have to increase the square footage for buildings like that to make it cost effective. Little detail on another house, the Emmanuel and Christina Anderson house. This is a great Queen Anne style home located on Roberts Avenue. And this one I kind of saw significance with two important individuals. The Andersons, who have always kind of been associated with this home, were leaders in the local Lutheran church, and they helped actually found Emmanuel Hospital in Portland. So certainly their contributions and their mark on the property had been noted. But I saw something else, a real opportunity to celebrate the work of the builder, who is a man named Charles Witter. And so, looking up Charles Witter, it turns out here he is fishing out at Blue Lake one day. Pulled a sturgeon out of Blue Lake. Yeah. So we have, this home, a great local example of the Queen Anne style. Emmanuel Anderson noted leader. But really, I saw this other opportunity here. And it's not official, this is in my opinion. Is that the Witter family, they came from Germany, and they actually built a strong majority of the homes in that neighborhood. So they're prolific home builders. And actually their contribution as an immigrant family coming to Gresham and building all these homes, that should mark some local significance. I think we should celebrate the builders, not just the architects.
I just missed it. What date was that built?
That one, let's go back and make sure. 1906.
Oh, there it is. Okay.
Yeah, and it's a fantastic home. I really recommend looking at all the detailed shingle work. You know, just about every little part of the house is clad in a different type of cladding. So it would have been a lot of carpentry, but it's been immaculately preserved. Give you a sample of another house. This is a dream home. You were asking about earlier, more modern structures. This is straight out of the post-war era. So 1946, Charles and Faye Olson, their dream home up on the hill. The cool thing about this particular building is the documentation, the history that helps tell the story. You might pass by it today and you think, oh, this is just another flat-roofed mid-century modern home. But the story actually goes that while Charles was overseas in World War II, he and Faye rode back and forth, and through their correspondence, they designed their dream home. And the great thing is that they actually would send each other, the literature of the time about modern home designs, how to build a kitchen and a bathroom and windows and all the trimmings of a modern home at the time period. And it's all reflected in their correspondence. And what's really fortunate is that they saved that. So, now the house is listed, this has all been documented, and it's really a treat to go through and see them fighting back and forth with each other when they're playing with, the plans or, the type of tile they're going to pick. And you have to remember the context too. This is in the middle of the war, and he's overseas fighting, and coming back, writing to his bride, exchanging these home designs. So it really was their dream home, and they were able to actualize it. And so it's a great home that helps tell that story.
His home was a great tangent. He was a math instructor at the high school. And that's all you had to do was say, how's your home?
Just ask him about it. Well, it's obvious. I mean, he knew every nook and cranny. The correspondence really reflects that. So kind of quickly, some other homes on the list by builders. Here's another one of the Witters homes. I mentioned that they were, that German immigrant family that built many homes in the region. Another one, it turns out that many of the homes were built by immigrant families, which I thought was a very interesting trend to see that our Gresham's kind of working class carpenters often came from other countries. So another one's the William K. Hamilton home. Hamilton was an Irish immigrant. He built the house in 1922. And he it was a flagship home to help develop that little area. The cool thing is if you go look at the chimney, it actually has the WK I think it's WKH. His initials are in the brickwork right here. And I ran into a lady just a couple weeks ago that was telling me she's related to this person. So another really significant home because of the building. The Kelly house, the Kelly family has an enormous contribution to Multnomah County history, but Emmett Kelly here in Gresham was a very significant person. He had a number of roles in the city, but one of them was as a developer and a builder. And so his home kind of reflects that story. The Reverend Dr. Alfred Thompson's home, significant also as a kind of a developer builder, but in a slightly different way. He came as the pastor for the church, for the Methodist Episcopal Church, and financed his own retirement through real estate speculation. So he built Thompson's Addition and to the city and kind of helped build and develop that part of Gresham. And in so doing, endowed the church and his own retirement that way. So I thought that was a really interesting lesson here that, you know, today you'll often hear preservationists not being so friendly with developers. We also do need to remember, though, that most of the homes that we're preserving today were built by developers, you know, just happened to be 100 years ago. So some important reminders that way. Another prolific building family was the Fieldhouse family. They built all three of these homes and actually several more in that First Edition neighborhood right next to the high school. They were in the town band, they were local merchants, just really, really interesting stories that can be told through these homes. So that's about the builders. Let's talk a little bit about some significant people. A great one is the Stapleton House. So this is a home that was built for George Stapleton, who was a Multnomah County Circuit Court judge. He worked in Portland, but he decided in 1913 to build his home and live in Gresham. He was just about a 5-minute walk from the Springwater line. So if we think about, you know, even at the turn of the century, Gresham kind of marketing itself as a quiet community that had access to Portland via the trains. And so he had this fantastic craftsman home built. It appears here in the Gresham Outlook in this is 1913, right before Christmas. And they're talking about all the homes you can go tour that are clad in Christmas lights. So we know in 1913, right after the first year he built the home, he had quite a Christmas light show. Stapleton's a really fascinating figure, big into the fraternal organizations here in Gresham, and he also dedicated the Eagle Creek Campground at the opening of the Columbia River Historic Highway. So he was a big proponent of getting out into nature. And that was one of the reasons why he moved to Gresham, because he wanted to be outside of the city and quicker access to Mount Hood and the Columbia River Gorge. The Peterson home, here's another home that of a significant person that really influenced Gresham. William Peterson built this craftsman home in 1909, just outside of the city, and he was an organizer. And so he developed and helped organize the Gresham Fruit Growers Association, and really put all the materials together for local fruit growers to share the costs of purchasing fertilizer, of transportation, of processing, and that work is what made Gresham at that time the raspberry capital of the world. So he had a very extensive raspberry, blueberry, strawberry farm, and I'm forgetting the middle school that's right next to this house.
Gordon Russell.
Gordon Russell, thank you. He donated a part of his farm for the land for Gordon Russell Middle School. So again, another very influential person that probably not a lot of people in Gresham have heard about, but we can tell and kind of bring his story up because the home's still there. The Van Donnick House, this is just across Division Street, probably one of the closer historic homes to us here at City Hall. So Ted Van Donnick was a Dutch immigrant. He owned the Gresham City Bakery and a potato farm. The other fascinating thing about him was that he was big on launching the tourism industry up at government camp. So he was a big-time skier and really wanted to make sure that Gresham was promoted as the stopping point for all the tourists to come and kind of rent their equipment before they went up and went skiing on Mount Hood. So he kind of really built the outdoor industry here in the city. Dr. Herbert Hughes' house, former mayor of Gresham. I've heard some interesting oral stories from people that live nearby him because he was a doctor and also the mayor. Apparently he was gone and traveling all hours of the day and night. So one person was talking about hearing him pull into his garage, in his 1930s Ford, and how you could hear him rumbling down Powell Boulevard to pull into this home at 2 o'clock in the morning, and he'd be back up at 5 a.m. to go work his 2 jobs. Another fantastically preserved home. The George Moen House, city councilman, chief of the fire bureau, and owner of an agricultural implement firm. This is another one of these homes that has like a fantastic story that's in the documentation. So they built the home during the Depression, and they saved the receipts of everything. So we know how much he paid for nails, where he bought the nails, where he got the concrete forms, just everything. And I forget the amount of he paid for materials. I think it was like $1,200 in total for materials to build the entire house. So just another cool house that we know a lot about because of the documentation. The Lewitt estate. This was a bit of a mystery. It actually took quite a bit of digging for me to figure out, who were these people. And after digging through several newspapers and trade publications, I learned that the husband and wife, Joseph, Cyril, and Ruth, when they built this house, they had extensive acreage, I think they had like 7 or 8 acres, and were known as the largest rabbit farm in the state of Oregon. So they would go to the state fair every year and were really known for their growing of rabbits. So I bet you could walk into their house and have some delicious Hassenpfeffer. Of course, the Zimmerman House. This is the first landmark property for Gresham. It's also a National Register home. Really, it's a museum today, and it helps tell the story of resettlement of the Oregon Territory. The Zimmermans, another immigrant family who had come here, had actually purchased a donation land claim, and really, if you go to the property today, it feels like you're going back in time because of all the acreage that surrounds it. The Gedemke home, right here on Powell, is helps tell the story of a farmer, a rural farmer here in Gresham that decides to move into the city. And he purchased the plans out of a catalog to build this home. And so this is a pre-Sears and Roebuck kit home that you would order, and then they'd send you all the materials and you put it together. And so it's quite a house. It's right there on Powell. I bet at the time that he built it, he probably had no neighbors. It was a very, very quiet road.
How did you discover it was a kit home?
There was a mention of it being a kit home, and then I went and was able to find, it's called a Cottage Souvenir. It was a publication that had all these designs in it, and then combing through it kind of found the one.
That's hard to do.
Yeah, it took some time, but fortunately so many books are digitized now, especially out of print pre-copyright books, so that helped. So some institutions. The Dwayne Gilley building on Main Street. Here's a great shot of the building when it was a hardware store and a dealer for Willie's Oberlin Car Company. That would have been that day. You're looking down, and it still bears that name of the building. Very little has changed for this building. It might not have all the glamour and glitz of some of the ornate craftsman homes, but I think that this actually has probably more integrity than some of the other buildings. Of course, the Gresham Carnegie Library really put Gresham on the map. with other communities that have had received that Carnegie Foundation funds. It's a beautifully designed library, and of course the home of the Gresham Historical Society today. The post office, another significant building in that it dates to the Depression era. And it was through the work of our local state representatives who really got the federal government to come in and dedicate the funds to build this building. But there was a lot of community input in the design. It wasn't just hire an architect from afar to build this particular post office. The community had quite a say in it. And that, I've learned, is somewhat rare for these Depression-era projects. They tended to be kind of top-down management. This one had a lot of grassroots advocacy too. The Condagon Hotel here on the corner, marketed itself as a downtown hotel at a time when there wasn't much of a Gresham downtown. They also hosted meetings for many of the fraternal organizations before they could build their structures. So I like to say that many of the founding institutions and ideas for the city likely occurred either in the ballroom or in the saloon of this hotel. One of them, the Masonic Lodge, they first held their meetings in this hotel before they gathered the funds to build the Masonic Lodge just nearby. So landmarks. There are other things besides houses that are on Gresham's historic landmark list. And I think that is somewhat unique to other cities. And it's a direction that I would encourage the Historic Landmarks Committee to continue down. Because I think you can use landmarks as a way to tell a much fuller and bigger history. So 3 of them that all relate to each other are the mile markers. Are any of you familiar with these mile markers? Yep. Yeah, there's kind of a cult following to them. So these mile markers run down Stark Street, and essentially Stark Street, it's right on top of the Willamette baseline. So the kind of origin point for all land surveys in our region come off of this line. And so these markers, I originally thought that they marked miles from the origin. It turns out they actually mark miles from the east bank of the Willamette River, which at that time there would have been a Stark Street ferry, and at that terminus of that ferry was the Multnomah County Courthouse. So back in the 1840s and the 1850s, when you needed to come into town to go to court to file paperwork or do anything, it was quite a journey. And so these stone markers kind of gave you and your horse cart an idea of how soon you'd be arriving at the courthouse. And it's great. Not all of them are still there, but it's a really fun trip to go down Stark Street and see how many you can see. And it continues on into Portland.
Where's the first one started?
The first one starts on the east bank of the Willamette, although it's not there yet.
I got you. All right.
I think the closest one, you would have to go all the way to the Lone Fir Cemetery,
Yeah,
and that's in Portland. The first one in Gresham is mile marker 11. The last one in Gresham is mile marker 14, and this is actually this is the parking lot to Mountain Community College. So you're actually, if you pull into the parking lot, then park as close as you can to Stark Street. You'll see this guy sticking out of the little berm.
And the other one is by the gym.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's a
They
gym.
moved it a little bit when they built it.
Stark is referred to as baseline.
Yeah, Stark was referred to as baseline because it was literally the baseline for all.
Baseline road.
Yeah, and so your legal description, you'll hear this term township and range. So, it'll often say, township 1 north, that refers to being 1 township north of baseline, or being 1 south of baseline.
Now, division was called section line
As section line,
before it was division.
and that again would kind of correlate to that, that grid system. And essentially all land in Oregon is surveyed off of this grid system that originates off of this baseline.
Wow.
And there's a section marker up on Walder's Hill, too.
Oh, yeah? Mm-hmm.
It's a brass, concrete.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Monument.
And so they've used this baseline, you know, in that land division process, absolutely. Another interesting landmark is this Pioneer Grave. It was originally the median for I-84. And so when they built I-84, they had to relocate the grave and the marker. But right now it's kind of right next to the Wilkes School. But it's a really old grave. It's a pioneer child that was traveling on the Oregon Trail. And she dies somewhere in the journey between Cascade Locks and here in Gresham and was buried. Another one, the satellite restaurant sign, and I'd like to put this in here because it's still a landmark. It's been removed, and I'm told it's in storage, and maybe someday it will return. So the neat thing about thinking about landmarks is that they allow for a little more flexibility. So a sign, could be a landmark, and it can have a new life as well. So
Where's the restaurant located?
this was on Burnside, and it's right near the.
It's right by the Rockwood.
Yeah, Rockwood. Yeah. Yeah, right there by the Rockwood Back Station, basically. Yeah, they demolished the restaurant and were able to save the sign.
Could a building and a landmark that was tied to it coexist in different places? Or would they have to be, or do they have to be tied together?
Yeah.
Located at the same place?
Well, then we run into this issue of what they call integrity. So if the building is a significant place, and that this is where this event happened, if you pick the building up and move it and change its location, it's lost that association to that specific place. If it's a significant building for its design, you can move a building that's a cool design, and you see these structures.
I guess what I'm referring to is, what if the satellite restaurant was still there and it was historic, but the sign had been taken down and removed at some point, then discovered again, not put back together, that they were both historic?
Yeah, I mean, I think there you would have to really be careful with crafting your argument to our Landmarks Commission, because they're the ones that are going to kind of make that deciding call. But I think there are ways where you can take a sign and have it landmarked and put it somewhere else. If it's associated with the building itself, then it's kind of lost that integrity, though. So it depends. It gets complicated. So what's missing in our landmarks here? So what I've told you is kind of a big, broad history of all the landmarks and properties in Gresham. And one of the things I was able to do is bring in a little more balance between, elite architect and home designer, bring in some social history with the builders, maybe a little more role of women in the history of these landmarks. But what I'm seeing are that our landmarks don't really reflect the full breadth and diversity of our community. So we have an impressive agricultural history. We're only touching the surface on that agricultural history. We have a long and very Native American history in this community. None of our landmarks are really speaking to that. So we can look, we have important contributions from Japanese laborers. Those aren't really being reflected or interpreted through our landmarks. Early African Americans in Gresham are not really being interpreted through our landmarks. Chinese laborers are not really being interpreted through our landmarks. And with a community with so much agricultural history, we should be doing a better job at telling the fuller story of all the people that were involved in building this community. so that is one of my big pushes, is that we need to do some more deep digging in the archives, and pounding the pavement and talking to people, and collaborating to find landmarks and buildings that tell this story too. So I have seen other cities that take parks that were significant, where significant cultural events happened. Maybe this was a park where the Chinese community met a long time ago and organized and had an event. Well, that can be turned into an argument for landmark status. There are Native American landscapes. There are significant buttes. I know some people in the Grand Ronde community that often talk about all the cinder cones we have out in Gresham, and I noticed that Hogan Butte, there's been all this great new work that the city's done up there. So maybe that's actually something where that tribal community might have some input and say, hey, that's an important place to us too, and maybe Gresham can honor that through landmark status.
I hope so.
I went home to Corvallis last weekend and was showing some friends, the place I grew up. And I was kind of disturbed to realize that my high school has been demolished, my middle school has been demolished, my elementary school has been demolished. All the places that I grew up and that shaped me aren't there anymore.
Yeah.
It felt like a ghost town. So one of the great things that you have here in Gresham are some landmark properties, like schools, like West Gresham Grade School. And think about how many people in the community, walked through these doors, got educations, went out and became incredible people and have incredible stories. That all of that can be told and tied back through this one building. And when that's gone, we've lost that unifier. We've lost that landmark to say, I was a student at West Gresham Grade School. Were any of you students at West Gresham Grade School? Yeah. So when that's gone, you feel like you're in a ghost town and you lose that commonality in that landscape. And so these aren't just spaces, these are places. And we transform we transform space into place as we give it meaning. And our stories are what give it meaning. So architectural features are great, but they don't necessarily tell the story. We can tell the stories. So I encourage you all to think about your stories and find ways to share them with other people. And I hope that you see value in our historic resources that way. So with that, I'd like to say thanks, and I'm happy to answer any questions really quick. Yeah.
My first question. I'm trying to remember what it was now.
Oh, your first question?
Incentives to register?
Yeah, the process, incentives.
Incentives to
How do
register?
you get a house on, was it?
Yeah, it was incentives. And in all honesty, I'd say I'd like to defer on that question. Yeah, to Mary. Yeah. Thank you.
So I think your original question was, are there incentives to register? We don't really have an incentive program, but we do often provide assistance for people looking to register their properties. I have my card, I'll put it on the table. I'm probably your first contact for this. But we often get grants from the state because we are a certified local government through the State Historic Preservation Office. This year's grant actually helped facilitate this event. So we often will provide assistance through those grants in doing the research and writing the nomination forms and going through the nomination process for either the local or the national registers.
And just to add on to that, one other thing that being a local landmark or a national register landmark kind of elevates the profile of your property. And so I've done documentary projects where we've been able to get grant funding because the property's listed. So it's not a direct incentive, but it is, you get that kind of tertiary benefit.
Do you have a liaison with the Historical Society?
I don't. I'm a member of the Historical Society, but other than just me going in there and talking with folks, no.
I guess I should ask why.
And which
With this,
let me clarify. Which Historical Society?
Gresham.
With Gresham? No, and actually I'm not a member there. That's where when I was doing this project, I think his last name, Matt. Yeah.
He's not there anymore.
He's not there anymore?
No.
Matt and Sylvie both helped me out quite a bit, my research in there. And that was just, we kind of had an arrangement with, they heard about this project, I said, that fits our mission, we'll help you out, give you scans, let you use any of our images for this. And so that was, yeah, their collections are just impressive and, go really deep. But they are somewhat limited as well with their staff resources and their ability to help you out. So I'm a pretty nimble researcher, and I was able to kind of take care of myself for the most part.
I'm on the board.
Okay.
And I have to leave, I'm sorry.
Great, yeah, you have a question?
You said the report was online, so could
Yes.
you be more specific?
Yes, so if you go to the Historic Resources Subcommittee page at the City of Gresham, you can get, it's a two-part report. I think it's something like 328 pages. But you can download the updated historic landmarks list. It's on
So
there.
that's just what's called this historic.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Were you able to find connections with the tribes at the History Museum here in Gresham?
That's,
References there?
yeah, there are certainly references, especially when you get into the government land office records. They actually mention, native trails. And so I've actually heard people say that Sandy Boulevard is the original, it's the oldest highway in the territory. And it was originally a Native American trail to get from a village near Portland to this mouth of the Sandy River. So there are definitely descriptions in diaries of kind of what the scene here for Native Americans looked like. But you also have to remember that at that time, they were suffering from devastating disease, and like 95% of the population had already been wiped out. So those descriptions are pretty bleak. They don't nearly characterize the vibrant, thriving community that was here prior to that disease. Those are
Or the ones that are coming back.
right. Well, and that's what's interesting today is that East County has the largest. I might be wrong on this now. A few years ago, it was the largest or the fastest growing Native American population in the country was in East Multnomah County. When you're 0.1% and you triple in size, that's huge gains. But there's a really strong urban Indian presence here today. Any other questions?
Overall, what's the number of properties that are within Gresham's inventory that could be, the city staff has identified as could be historic?
Well, in that 1987 report, I think they identified something like 50 properties. And in the 80s, they were really interested in scoring properties. And so they were really looking at the architectural elements to see how much of the building had been altered over time. And so that's why not all 50 of those made that list. But that would be something I'd say today might be worth revisiting. That those 50, saying, is there a deeper social history? Perhaps it's not architectural, but perhaps it's social. And you can get that report, that 1987 report, from the State Historic Preservation Office in Salem. Although, just you guys have it here too?
I might be able to dig up a copy. We also have some reconnaissance level surveys that have happened since then that identify properties that could potentially be significant but don't fully evaluate them. And I don't know the total number because we've done it kind of over the years, neighborhood by neighborhood.
Mm-hmm. And the last thing I'd add is, the landmark term is quite broad. And so I've actually seen some municipalities go into what they call a district, a landmark district, where they'll say, maybe not this particular home, but if we take all 50 homes in this little development, and we've got a 1950s suburban development that really is evocative of that period and that design, and it still maintains that integrity. We could say, well, it's not just the one house, it's all 50, and that in and of itself is something kind of interesting and, worth landmarking. So it can be quite flexible. You just have to work, to justify it with the documentation. Yeah. Great. Well, thank you very much. Oh, there's one more in the back. Yeah.
Oh, so the scarring thing versus other ways of looking at it, would that deal with things like the fact that the old high school was not listed?
Yeah, that's exactly.
Because they've done other things to it afterwards.
That's exactly how I understand the high school in particular. It was ranked pretty low in its architectural score, and so it didn't get that local landmark listing. I think today we might look at it differently and say, well, maybe there was a social element or a significant person. And if you think about a redevelopment project, if you've listed your property for a social pattern or a significant person, it's actually easier to work with this landmark listing because you can change the fabric, the exterior fabric of the building, if it still maintains that association to a person. So we don't have to be afraid of landmark listing if you're into renovation or development. It's all about how you argue it.
I would say, as it relates to the high school, one of the things that staff tried to focus on was making sure, to the point that you made earlier about wanting the architecture to be more contemporary or different from the historic. That was, even though it's not an historic building, it was a conscious effort on our part to be able to distinguish between what was historic like and what is, a 21st century school.
Mm-hmm.
So, there was designs where the addition seemed more like the original school, and we worked with the architect. In fact, John Hiley here did most of the work to sort of really focus on that differentiation to sort of play up the existing facade in the building, sort of make clear this is what was there, this is what's new, and you're celebrating both.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah, and I think that it's really important when we're talking about historic preservation not to get stuck in a kind of a feedback loop of saying, well, that's different than it originally was. You have to remember the buildings are constantly evolving. Like, a lot of these buildings didn't have electricity. Well, they do now. So, should we not put electricity in buildings? No, of course not. That's not useful, and that's going to make that building obsolete, and we're not going to be able to have it. So being able to be flexible and identify what your elements are significant to the building, what can be retained, what can be adapted. I think it's actually a quite exciting time in preservation because we're seeing a lot more people thinking very innovative about how to preserve these buildings. Cool. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it.